Tecmo Super Bowl on the Super Nintendo is a big disappointment.
First down.
Everything feels slow and delayed, especially the famous cutscenes. Though Tecmo fixed some of the bugs with the older versions, certain frustrations still exist, like that famous nose tackle lurch. And worst of all, a lot of the color and fun was taken out of the halftime show. So while the game does take advantage of the improved Super Nintendo hardware, the Super Nintendo version of Tecmo Super Bowl just does not have the same feel as the NES version. In particular, the game feels really slow, really lethargic. It seems to also have trouble playing music at the same time that the game is actually going. This is surprising, especially since we're talking about a vastly improved video game system, plus a game that came out a full 2 years after the original. Now, I should tell you that this game is essentially unchanged from the original Tecmo Super Bowl. In addition to roster changes, the most notable improvement is that you can select different weather to play in. Unfortunately, it seems that the weather is only there for a cosmetic effect. It doesn't seem to have any real impact on gameplay.
Touchdown.
And it's also not unique to the Super Nintendo version of this game. The Sega Genesis version also has variable weather. Now, as far as the graphics are concerned, the Super Nintendo version of Tecmo Super Bowl is clearly superior to the NES version, for the most part that is. As you probably already know, the NES version suffers from sprite flickering and other small graphical glitches. As you can see here, the superior Super Nintendo hardware means that the sprite flickering is gone. If you look closely, however, you will realize that the NES version actually shows a little bit more of the field. The Super Nintendo version has a narrower field, it doesn't show you as many yards, and it shows you more of the crowd for some reason. So while the graphics are obviously improved, they still don't have that smooth feel that you get with the NES version of the game, and the cutscenes really have a lot to do with that. Obviously, anybody who has played this game before knows that the cutscenes in Tecmo Super Bowl are really what makes the game so much fun. While there are also cutscenes in the Super Nintendo version, the scenes feel really delayed, and they tend to slow things down quite a bit.
Touchdown.
Now, the Super Nintendo version is pretty cool since the weather actually shows up in the cutscenes. That's a really nice touch. But I just can't get over the bizarre way things slow down every time the screen changes or shows you a message. And then you get the sound, which is the worst part of the Super NES version, and you're going to have to listen closely to understand what I'm talking about. But here's what the NES version sounds like. Here's the Genesis version. And here's the Super Nintendo version.
First down.
So as you can see, or as you can hear, the Super NES samples sound a little bit better than the Genesis samples. However, the music is not really continuous and everything feels really jerky with a start and stop kind of feel to it. Now there is a technical reason for this, as well as a reason why the overall game experience is worse on the Super Nintendo, but let's look at that sound first. Okay, if you look at the insides of the original Sega Genesis, you will notice this chip right over here. This is the Yamaha YM2612 chip. This is a 6-channel FM synthesizer chip that provides the Genesis with its music. Sega had used the chip in its arcade games for years and it just went full speed ahead with it. As described in this blog post by Fatnik Industries, the YM2612 chip was great because it could use different sounds together to make noise that sounded at least somewhat like actual instruments. Now, the best way to understand this is to listen to music in Sega Genesis games. And since we're talking about a football game released in 1993, we might as well look at one of the most popular and famous video games from 1993. This would be Disney's Aladdin. The music in Aladdin on the Genesis is nothing short of amazing, and it shows off the full capabilities of that YM2612 chip. The gameplay of this version of Aladdin is famous, and rumor has it that the Disney animators who made the movie also made the animations for this game. In hindsight, however, the real highlight here is the sound, especially that really impressive MIDI music. Now, things were a little bit different on the Super Nintendo side. The Super Nintendo did not have that fancy MIDI sound chip, and it shows. Now, if you look at the Super Nintendo motherboard, you will notice something different. This baby right here is the SSMP chip. This is the Super Nintendo sound chip. This sound chip had its own 8-bit processor, a digital signal processor, and a 64 kilobyte pool of RAM. However, since the SSMP chip was a proprietary chip, programmers didn't really know what to do with it, whereas the YM2612 was well documented and easy to use. And so, for the most part, Super Nintendo games have audio that is a bit compromised. Capcom made the Super Nintendo version of Aladdin, and you can hear the sound differences right from the start. The Super Nintendo version of the game is more of a platform jumper than a beat 'em up, and it plays a little bit slower. The graphics here are not quite as crisp as the Genesis version, despite the color advantages that the Super Nintendo's visual processors technically had. In my opinion, though, the biggest difference here is in the music. The Super Nintendo version just doesn't sound as good, even though the chip is technically better than the Yamaha MIDI chip. But as you probably already know, this really depends on the game. Most programmers struggled with the Super Nintendo. However, there were some companies that thrived on the platform. As you probably already know, games like Super Castlevania sound absolutely amazing on the Super Nintendo and will make you forget all about Aladdin on the Genesis in a flash. On the other hand, NBA Jam on the Super NES has no music at all, which makes you feel like you're playing in a church. The difference is most apparent when you look at Madden 94, which sounds nice in the Genesis, even though it's a shame that the MIDI is only being used to make crowd static. In my opinion, the Super Nintendo version of Madden 94 looks better and plays more smoothly, but the sound is awful. But of course, the most famous video game music from this era happens to be on the Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy VI, known in North America as Final Fantasy III, had such an impressive soundtrack that a section of the game was actually built around it. This is the infamous opera scene from Final Fantasy VI, which I personally think represents the height of 16-bit creativity. You're given a time limit to complete your mission as the opera continues on in the background. And there are scenes where you have to choose the correct lyrics to continue. The result is just absolutely captivating. This is seriously one of the best moments in all of video game history. Anyway, I could go on with this. Games designed by Nintendo like Super Mario World have incredible sound. Games like Mega Man X have fantastic sound. And of course, Final Fantasy VI is the most famous example of the Super Nintendo sound capabilities. But the vast majority of Super Nintendo games don't take advantage of what the sound could do on the system. This is largely because of how difficult it is to program games for the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo had a lot of modulation capabilities that could make the sound do things you just couldn't do on the Genesis. The problem is that games like Tecmo Super Bowl just didn't take advantage of those capabilities. Instead, it sounds like this game was created with a cheap MIDI keyboard, something incapable of playing music with feeling or sensitivity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an awful game. Now, this was held back by the difficulty of programming for the system, that much is sure. And honestly, it's kind of surprising that the game is so jerky, considering that it took Tecmo a whopping 2 years between when the NES version was released and when the Super NES version finally came out. Now, if you know your Super Nintendo games, you're probably wondering why Tecmo Super Bowl on the Super Nintendo was so bad when Tecmo Super NBA Basketball was so good. Tecmo Super NBA Basketball on the Super NES was leaps and bounds better than the NES version. It was faster, it looked better, and it sounded better. The NES version suffers from a lot of screen flickering, from colors that look the same, and from some pretty bad music. Now, to be honest with you, I don't really understand why Tecmo was able to make such a polished Super Nintendo basketball game and yet couldn't quite figure out how to improve the football game. And there really are a lot of issues with the Super NES version of Tecmo Super Bowl. For one thing, the game uses basically only 2 buttons and it still only gives you 8 plays. Now, games like Madden 94 are not perfect, but at least they gave you some play calling variety. Even worse, though, is the fact that Tecmo Super Bowl and the Super NES really only uses the same 2 buttons. You seriously could probably just use the NES controller if you wanted. The A and B buttons control everything in this game, which is kind of odd considering how many buttons the controller has. Anyway, I guess it's nice that you can call a dive play if you want, though there aren't many situations where you would rather do this than, call an actual running play. And you can take a touchback after a kickoff, which is something missing in the NES game. Like I said though, the gameplay itself is basically the same as the NES version, except that the sound isn't quite as good and the game stutters a lot when you get to the cutscenes. Anyway, there you have it. Tecmo Super Bowl is still a fun game on the Super Nintendo. However, I would rather play the Genesis or the NES versions any day. Now, while I think the arcade-style gameplay is better than like Madden 94, most gamers don't agree with me, and especially not those who were buying games back in December 1993. Tecmo did have 2 more shots at the 16-bit football scene though, but we'll get to those in another video.